give you some perspective on what the transportation work group has come up with. I can read this. It has concluded that the greenhouse gas reduction ambitions of 100% renewable energy for municipal transportation by 2030, that's out of the council direction that we received in 2018, and community transportation by 2035 are not feasible if vehicles with internal combustion engines, known as ICE vehicles, continue to operate within the city of Bellingham, city limits. Gesundheit or whatever, yeah. Therefore, the measures being recommended by the work group will only partially decrease the greenhouse gas emissions by disincentivizing the use of ICE vehicles within the city of Bellingham, and while supporting the transition to electric vehicles and to mode shift to biking, walking, or rolling, which is a new way of defining some of the modalities that people are using nowadays, scooters and skateboards and wheelchairs and other rolling mechanisms. And these measures are in draft form, as you'll see as we go through here. They're fairly rough in some places, and they'll be refined as we complete the feasibility and analysis for each of the recommendations.
Okay, thanks, Claire. Okay, so hi everyone. My name's Christine Grant. I just teach energy policy up at Western Washington University, and I've worked in clean energy and transportation for about 10 years, so that's my background. And we were going to have another slide in here about the process that we went through, and we ran out of time. Like everyone has said, these are all very draft measures at this point, but Rick and I met with probably about 25 people in the community that work on transportation, and collectively have probably put over 100 hours really digging into this issue. So we have really gone to bat for you guys, and this is the best that we have right now. So we're gonna just go right for the tough topic, which is parking reform. So we talked to lots of different people, from transit to many very talented city staff members to biking advocates, and parking reform was one of the biggest things that people talked about. Donald Shoup, who's considered kind of the world's expert on parking reform, says that free parking is a fertility drug for driving. And internal combustion engines are one of the, single occupancy internal combustion use is what's driving most of our transportation emissions. So we have a lot of different ideas about how to reform parking. There are a lot of really smart parking nerds at the city that are really looking into all of this too, and I think that we should really heavily rely on them as we kind of finalize or get further along talking about the purpose or the role of these measures. But so I wanted to first show this. This is an image that one of my students made, Stanley Roper. He's in Happy Valley. He's about 10 minutes away from the Western campus, so pretty walkable neighborhood. The orange represents parking, and the blue is the public right-of-way. So that's where, all of us can drive, bike, walk, but it just shows how much of Happy Valley is dedicated to parking. So our measures that we want to talk about are revenue neutral or revenue positive downtown parking program. So right now we're losing money on our downtown parking program. It costs more money to operate than they bring in. And so we think that we should increase the price of parking, and so that we are, either revenue neutral or revenue positive. And any profit from the downtown parking program should be invested in visible improvements on the metered streets. But the idea here is just that price signals have a tremendous influence on our travel behavior, and parking downtown is incredibly cheap, especially compared even to taking the bus. Unbundled parking, we read some research that came out of UCLA that said that unbundled parking has a pretty dramatic opportunity to reduce VMT. Unbundled parking is basically just this idea that when you rent right now, typically you don't have, the cost of parking is included with your rent. And so more and more communities are encouraging the cost of parking to be explicit. The cost of parking garage or parking facilities is a pretty high percentage of overall rent. And so people make better, more rational decisions if you give them the information about how much parking costs. So it encourages people to go car-free if they don't need a car. So we'll get more into all of this, but some of the research shows that unbundling parking could reduce VMT by up to 27%. We think that we should change parking minimums to parking maximums. So right now, we tell developers that they need to build a certain amount of parking. What we think we should do is we should say, if you want to build that much parking, you can, but if you don't want to put any parking in your building, that's fine too. A single parking stall adds between $20,000 to $50,000 to total projects, and it is more and more people are projected to not own a car. Personal car ownership is declining, and some experts think that it's going to decline really, really rapidly due to advancements in transportation as a service, which I talked about at the last task force meeting. We also think that there should just be an increase in parking education overall. So these are signs from Lewiston, Maine, which is a pretty similar town to Bellingham in a lot of ways. And they just recently started this parking education program sponsored by the city. It's called Design Lewiston, and they've put signs up all over their city near parking facilities, just letting people know about the cost of parking and how it influences our urban form. So, you can read the one on the left pretty well, but over here it says, if built today, the Basilica of St. Peter and Paul, New England's second largest church, would have to include so many parking spaces that the grand building you see today wouldn't be possible. So just kind of getting people, giving people more information about what some of these parking regulations that we created in the 1930s, 1940s is actually doing to our urban form, and getting people comfortable with the idea of changing it. So yes, we need to start thinking more about parking and how that influences our travel behavior. But the fact of the matter is that we have a lot of people that move from the county into the city every day, and likewise live in the city but move outside of the city. And how are we going to address that VMT? So Derek Long is going to come up and talk about our next measure, which relates to compact development.
There's a lot of research you can do around this topic, and all the ones we're struggling with climate reduction, but there's a clear correlation between compact development and lower vehicle miles traveled, and therefore lower greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, this is logical, right? And so I'm going to suggest that our committee is going to recommend some policies that certainly reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also have a ton of co-benefits. And I've spoken to this in a couple of other meetings, that the research suggests that compact development also has great public health benefits. It also has a reduced cost per capita of public infrastructure and public service costs. So it also has economic development growth potential. So there are co-benefits that we want to definitely pay attention to. I noticed that the recommendations that we're likely to provide are very consistent with the 2016 Comprehensive Plan update, which is super important, and the chapters on environment, housing, and land use. And another thought occurred to us when we were talking about land use is that complex planning, like climate planning, is best done at a regional level. It's just like economic development planning, transportation planning. Climate planning is best done at a regional level, because you can imagine if we start to require in our beautiful little island of Bellingham for example, lots of great ideas in building retrofits and new construction standards to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we may very well unintentionally cause people to move their businesses and their households outside of the city limits where housing will be cheaper, and we end up with more vehicle miles traveled back and forth, like the circular graphic that Christine just shared. So I'm going to refer a lot to this study from the foundation of the Urban Land Institute, which is a summary report that looked at 3 very large studies. The link is going to be available to everyone, that showed that compact development can give you an 8 to 20% reduction, in some cases up to 60% reduction in vehicle miles traveled and greenhouse gas reductions. And when they talk about compact development, I think it's important to stress that it's about 11 to 15 dwelling units per acre, and I'll show you some pictures of what that looks like real quick. Let's see. Why don't we just go ahead and show a picture. This is a picture of Mathai Place, which is a Colchian Community Land Trust built in Happy Valley about 10 to 12 years ago. This is 14 units an acre. This 11 to 15 units an acre is a scale of development or a density that is sometimes referred to as a missing middle kind of scale, right? The kind of development that might fit very well in terms of character and so on in that transition zone between urban villages and the downtown into a single family zone. This is another picture of what missing middle housing might look like. So on the right here, you might see over the coming years this mid-rise kind of development happening. It's already happening in Fairhaven and downtown, but you can see it on the waterfront. You can imagine how it might scale down over a couple of blocks into a housing form that integrates very well with single-family housing. Currently, just to give you a sense of how we use our land in the city of Bellingham, 75% of our land is designated for housing in the city of Bellingham. 42% of the total land is for residential. 75% of that 42% is in single-family homes. Urban villages take up less than 5%, and that includes downtown, less than 5% of our total land. And so one of the recommendations that we might come forward with is, what would it look like if we had 75% of our new growth going to downtown and urban villages over the coming years, maybe 20% of the new growth going into the missing middle housing forms that transition from urban villages to single families, and maybe just 5% in single family zones. And that's a way to get 10 to 20% greenhouse gas reductions for our city. Let me show you a graphic. This is a comparison of the footprint of Atlanta versus Barcelona. You can see the populations and the wealth between the two cities are very similar. The urban area is quite different, and the transportation carbon emissions per person are about 10% in Barcelona of the Atlanta population. And then my last slide is just quickly talking about the higher potential. The evidence seems to show that if you add more dwelling units to already dense areas, then the greenhouse gas reductions go even farther down. Probably likely because of just how much closer you are to busing options, walking options, closer you are to jobs, shopping, and those sorts of things. And so here is again, perhaps a recommendation is policies that'll give us 75% of new growth in urban villages, 20% in missing middle transition zones, and 5% in single family. Yeah, and our next presenter is Christine again.
So we decided to call this measure Design Transportation Infrastructure for People, Not Cars. Claire wanted to call it Walk and Roll. But, you know, the idea is just that we want to, for so long, we've designed our transportation infrastructure around the personal automobile. And that is changing. We're seeing some great changes already in Bellingham, and we just basically want to continue on that trajectory and continue improving. So this is something that a transportation planner from Vancouver, BC, wrote about how to iteratively improve our active transportation system. And so we wanted to share this just to say that you know, this is something that we hope will be a part of the city of Bellingham's entire culture. And I think from the people that I've talked with in Public Works, that's true, and we're all still continuing to learn. We haven't been doing bike infrastructure for very long in the United States, and so we still have a lot to learn from places like Denmark and Holland and other parts of Europe and Japan. So as far as getting into specific measures, we would recommend supporting an e-scooter program and possibly a bike share program. The e-scooter programs are really cost competitive other than staff time to kind of set up a permit and work with the operators when they initially come to a city. It's free, and in some cases the operators will actually pay the city to operate on your city streets. So there are e-scooter programs in 136 cities just in the United States now. Portland has done a really good job assessing their program, and they have seen VMT reductions they did a 120-day pilot, and they did see that some mode was shifted from walking to scootering, so people wanted to go faster, but it definitely shifted mode away from driving and ride hailing. And so it wouldn't be a massive VMT reduction, kind of looking at what Portland saw for that first 120-day pilot. It would probably be a less than 1% VMT reduction. But for anyone that's worked in transportation, getting any VMT reduction is really hard. So that is a positive thing. We should invest in, we should welcome those new mobility options here in our city. And then the other recommendation is more prototyping of protected bike infrastructure. So again, you know, we're still learning how to redesign our streets so that they're safe for people that are not in cars. And we already have some really great bike infrastructure in Bellingham, but we need to continue improving. And one really good way of doing that is putting in kind of piloting infrastructure. They call it prototyping. Here they call it, this is the city of Denver is doing these pop-up protected bike lanes. It also really helps kind of ease the concerns of business owners. If you're going to take out parking and put in a bike lane, you know, obviously there's some reaction from business owners. And so by piloting a protected bike lane where you take parking out, you can actually track retail sales. And in nearly every case, cities have found that protected bike lanes actually bring increased retail sales, sometimes quite substantially. So the other thing is I don't know why we put in twice a year, but just more all-staff active transportation planning. So the city currently doesn't have a specific bike ped transportation planner. And we thought about recommending that, but decided not to, and really thought, you know, this is something that affects the planners. It affects people that go out and maintain our streets. It affects everyone that works in transportation. And so just continuing to promote a culture shift is what we're recommending. And this is just a screenshot from the Spokesman Review. Spokane has a scooter share program. They're putting in a lot of more transportation, active transportation infrastructure. So just, you know, continuing to bring in thought leaders and the staff that we talked to that went to Copenhagen for the study mission clearly learned a lot from that, and we think those things are really important. So transportation electrification, is our fourth measure. We think that this is critical, and we're in really productive conversations with Puget Sound Energy, and they have just rolled out a electric vehicle program. But there's definitely things that the city could do as well to promote electric vehicles. The tactic that we've seen that's worked the best for city governments is called a group buy, which is basically the city or an organization, a nonprofit that works closely with the city can work directly with vehicle manufacturers, and basically it's bulk purchasing. You get like 100 people to agree to buy an electric vehicle, and it can reduce the cost of the electric vehicle, sometimes by quite a lot. So Boulder, Eugene, kind of the usual suspects have been doing these electric vehicle group buys. We think we should do an electric bike group buy also. I don't know if anyone's done that. And then support electric vehicle charging infrastructure. Again, I think PSE is our most important partner on this, but there are grants that come that are available that the city should be chasing those grant dollars for EVSE infrastructure. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to pull up a graph from Charlie.
Yeah, so cumulative voided emissions for different scenarios. So baseline is obviously like we don't void any emissions whatsoever. And then the first one is increasing density, population density in urban villages. So this is 75% increase in density in these urban villages. The next one is an 8% increase in bike usage. So right now it's about 4%, so bumping it up to 12%. And again, all these are phased in over time. The third scenario is phasing in unbundled parking, which was that other scenario. And if we add up those first three scenarios, we get to this cumulative voided reductions of what, like 1.2 megatons of CO2. So quite significant. But these, as great as these are, and we should implement these things, they pale in comparison to electrification of vehicles. So phasing in of electric vehicles from about 1% adoption today to 100% adoption by 2040 would result in these three different scenarios based on PSE's grid mix. The first one is their present day grid mix, which will change immediately at 2022 and turn into this second scenario, which is more gas dominated. And then if it became more renewable dominated, it would look like this bottom line here. You can notice that adding these first three scenarios from baseline, it's about a 1/3 reduction. And so if we implemented these here, it wouldn't be that same giant gap because this is a reduction off of gasoline-powered vehicles. But you'd get another about a third way down the curve if we implemented these with electrification. So it goes with our general mantra, like use less energy, that would be reducing VMT, and then electrify that energy, that would be switching to EVs, and then make the electricity clean. And so if we implement all those three things, we'd probably be down somewhere in here. If we look at our actual emissions, not just the delta, it looks something like this. So again, the scenarios are the same. Here's adding up the first three scenarios, reducing VMT, and then this is full electrification by the point you're down here. And so we're not going to get to zero, but we already know that. But we would have this huge reduction from baseline and then avoid, several megatons of CO2, which is great.
So, yeah. So we've spent a couple months looking at a lot of the measures that Christine and Derek have been talking about and getting very excited about those. And then really it was just last Friday, I think it was, that we saw the first draft of this graph that Charlie put together. And then we saw the latest version just yesterday. And I just want to make sure everybody's aware that really it's that orange line there. So everything that we talked about earlier in terms of parking, density, mode share, at least bike mode share, and all of that, all together is that orange line. And starting on the far left, and this is total transportation emissions for the community in Bellingham, starting on the far left is present day, 2019. If you go out to 2035, it's the same as it is today. All that we've done is we have not allowed for the growth of population to add to the growth of greenhouse gas emissions. But it's still the same emissions as it is today, assuming our numbers are within the ballpark. The only way to get anywhere near the goal, the transportation goal that the city council has set for the city and the mayor has set for the city, the only way to do it is through electrification of our vehicles, all of our vehicles. That's the only way to do it. Now, there may be other factors, and again, we should never take a graph like this and just say this is exactly the way the numbers are, but it shows the scale. It shows the scale of the difference between some of the measures we could take that we were talking about and then what really it's going to take if we're going to meet these goals in the short term. Christine and I were talking before the meeting. It's not an either or. It's not do one set of things or do the other. It's do it all, because reducing greenhouse gas emissions as quickly as we can, that's electric vehicles. But the social benefit from doing a lot of the other things that we were talking about, that Derek was talking about, and densification and whatnot, that's a longer term, that's for the overall societal good. The greenhouse gas reductions from that, however, are longer term. So in the short term, it's electrification of vehicles. In the longer term, it's that plus, very importantly, all of these other things. So I just wanted to make that understood to the public and to the rest of the task force members that this was a game changer graph for me in terms of where do we give our emphasis now versus where we might give it longer term.